In 1952, the Air Force issued a notice with a date and no body. Captain Jerome Goebel vanished aboard a C-124 over Alaska, and the paper said only that recovery was not possible. His family kept the envelope, its crease rubbed thin by hands that reopened it. "I'll be back before winter," Jerome had said, a sentence that stayed in the room long after he didn't. 73 years later, in 2025, ICE returned a name. Two moments face each other without explanation. What moved on when Jerome did not? Jerome Goebel woke before the alarm because he always did. It was not discipline so much as habit. A small bargain he made with himself each morning: if he rose early, the day would feel manageable. The room was still dark, the kind of dark that pressed close in Alaska even when morning was supposed to be coming. He lay still for a moment, listening to the muted hum of the bass beyond the window, then swung his legs to the floor and felt the cold climb into his feet. He washed his face with water that never quite warmed. The mirror above the sink reflected a man who looked older than his years, not from fatigue, but from responsibility. Jerome studied that face, the way he studied instruments, checking, not judging. He shaved carefully, wiping the blade clean after every pass because nicks were annoying and bled too long in cold air. When he finished, he pressed a towel against his skin and breathed out. Another day, he thought. Just another flight. The uniform was laid out the night before. He had learned early that rushing made him careless. Shirt first, then trousers, then the belt pulled snug. He touched the wings on his chest as he pinned them on, not as a ritual, but to make sure they were straight. In the pocket, already waiting, was his dog tag. He checked for it automatically, fingers brushing the metal, the faint clink reassuring in its familiarity. The mess hall smelled of coffee and grease. Jerome sat alone at a narrow table, a plate pushed toward him with eggs that had cooled too quickly. He ate because it was time to eat, not because he was hungry. Around him, chairs scraped and voices overlapped, but none of it demanded his attention. His thoughts stayed with the list folded in his pocket, the handwritten checklist he trusted more than memory. Instruments, fuel, cargo balance, weather report. He mouthed a few items silently, as if rehearsing lines before a performance. A crewmate slid into the seat across from him, steam rising from a mug held in both hands. "Routine hop," the man said, attempting lightness. Jerome nodded. Routine, Jerome echoed and meant it. No one spoke of danger. There was no language for it in this context. This was transport, not combat. A job defined by repetition. He finished eating, wiped his mouth, and stood. Outside, the aircraft weighted, its bulk dimly outlined against the sky. The C-124 looked patient, almost forgiving, as if it understood the burdens placed upon it. Jerome walked toward it with his checklist, now open, pencil tucked behind his ear. The cold bit through his gloves as he ran his hand along the fuselage, feeling the metal beneath. He listened, as much as he looked, attuned to sounds that didn't belong. He climbed into the cockpit and began the sequence he had performed countless times. Switches, gauges, numbers aligning where they should. The checklist was creased from use, smudged with fingerprints and graphite. He liked that. It meant it had earned its place. Each completed item was marked with a small, decisive line. When he paused, it was not from uncertainty, but from care. "Everything looks good," a voice said from behind him. Jerome glanced back and nodded. "Let's keep it that way," he replied. There was a moment, brief and unremarkable, when he thought of writing a letter. He had promised one, promised he would send it as soon as he landed. He pictured the person waiting, imagined the relief that would come with a simple confirmation of safety. He did not write it then. There would be time later, he told himself. There was always time later. As they prepared for departure, Jerome felt the familiar narrowing of focus. The world reduced itself to what mattered immediately. Numbers, signals, coordination. The engines came alive beneath him, a vibration that traveled through the seat and into his bones. He adjusted his headset and spoke when required, voice steady, uninflected. The runway stretched ahead, a pale line against the surrounding terrain. Jerome's hands rested on the controls, relaxed but ready. He thought briefly of winter, of returning before it fully set in. "I'll be back before winter," he had said, not as a vow, but as an expectation. Seasons were something to schedule around. The aircraft lifted, and the base fell away. Below, the ground became abstract shapes without detail. Jerome checked his instruments, then checked them again. Clouds gathered ahead, thickening the air. The weather report had mentioned this, but reports were only approximations. He adjusted course slightly, compensating. Inside the cockpit, the sounds were constant and familiar. The engine's rhythm, the occasional crackle of radio traffic. Jerome listened, filtering out what did not concern him. His checklist was folded now, its work done for the moment tucked safely away. Time passed in increments marked by routine checks. Jerome's body knew when to look, when to adjust. He felt calm, anchored by procedure. If there was any fear, it did not announce itself. It sat quietly, a background awareness that came with the job never sharp enough to demand attention. At one point, turbulence shook the aircraft, a sudden roughness that jolted the cabin. Jerome tightened his grip eyes, scanning the panel. He compensated smoothly, bringing the plane back into balance. All good, he said more to himself than anyone else. He thought again of the letter, of the waiting. The idea that someone measured time by his absence did not unsettle him. It was simply a fact, like fuel consumption or distance remaining. He planned to be present again soon. That was enough. The cold intensified as they moved deeper into the route. Ice threatened, a possibility always noted, never welcomed. Jerome adjusted settings following procedure. The aircraft responded obedient for now. There was a moment when the horizon disappeared, entirely swallowed by cloud. The world outside became a uniform gray. Jerome relied on instruments, trusting them over instinct. He had done this before, many times. He reminded himself of that not as reassurance, but as confirmation. "Visibility's gone," a voice said. "I know," Jerome replied. His tone did not change. He made a note, mental, precise. The checklist returned to his hands, unfolded again. He ran through it item by item, pencil marking progress. Each line completed was a small act of order against uncertainty. He liked the feeling of control it gave him. Somewhere behind them, cargo shifted slightly, a sound barely noticeable. Jerome registered it and moved on. Everything within parameters. Everything as expected. If there was a last moment of normalcy, it was this: Jerome, adjusting a dial, humming under his breath without realizing it. A tune he could not have named. The aircraft steady, the crew attentive. The idea of danger distant, abstract. He did not think of legacy. He did not think of lists or records. He thought of landing, of sending that letter, of returning before winter. His focus remained on the immediate task, the next adjustment, the next check. "Almost there," someone said. Jerome nodded, eyes forward. "Almost," he echoed. The cold pressed harder, the air thickening. The instruments demanded more attention now, their readings subtle but insistent. Jerome leaned closer, narrowing his focus further. There was no room for distraction. If he felt anything like apprehension, it manifested as concentration. He followed procedure, trusted training. The checklist once more was his anchor. He did not know this was the last routine flight. There was no signal, no warning that distinguished it from the others. It unfolded as days always had, shaped by habit and expectation. The aircraft continued into the gray, carrying Jerome Goebel and his quiet confidence forward. Somewhere, someone waited for a letter. Somewhere, winter gathered itself. Jerome kept his hands steady and his eyes on the instruments, doing exactly what he had always done, believing that would be enough. Jerome Goebel did not experience what came next. That was the cruel shape of it. The world kept moving. Decisions were made, documents were stamped, but none of it passed through his senses. And yet, every action still circled him, defined by the fact that he could no longer answer. The first sighting of the wreckage came days after the flight failed to arrive. A search aircraft passed over the Chugach Range and glimpsed torn metal against ice. Somewhere beneath that white surface was the last place Jerome's hands had been steady on the controls. He never saw the mountains rush up. He never felt the impact. What remained of him was already sealed away, unreachable. A search officer stood at the edge of the map table, gloved finger tracing a line that ended abruptly. "This is where Goebel's aircraft should have cleared," he said. The name was spoken as a coordinate, not yet a loss. Jerome had become a point on paper. Helicopters could not land safely. Ground teams could not reach the site without risking more lives. Snow fell steadily, indifferent and thorough. Each hour that passed changed the terrain, smoothing sharp edges, burying what had been briefly visible. The glacier moved as it always had, slow and unstoppable, taking fragments with it. Jerome's body lay somewhere inside that movement. He did not know the waiting had begun. The official language followed quickly. Unable to recover. The phrase was precise, bloodless. It described terrain, weather, logistics. It did not describe a man who had promised to be back before winter. It did not describe the unfinished letter. At home, the notice arrived, folded once then again. A family member read the words aloud, stopped, then read them again more slowly, as if pace might change meaning. Jerome's name appeared in formal type, complete and intact. That alone suggested hope. A name without a body could still return. There was no funeral, no object to touch. Jerome's dog tag was not handed back. It remained with him wherever he was. His uniform stayed in the closet, pressed and ready, waiting for a reason to be worn again. The waiting became a routine of its own. Months passed, then years. Each inquiry received the same response, altered only by date. Jerome's status did not change. He existed in a category that resisted closure. Not alive, not declared dead, suspended. A clerk updated a ledger and paused briefly over the entry. Captain Jerome Goebel, she read quietly, then moved on. The page did not record his habits, his checklist, the way he hummed without noticing. It recorded only that he had not been found. Time stretched. Snow seasons layered over each other on the glacier, compressing history into depth. The aircraft wreckage shifted incrementally, carried down slope, breaking apart under pressure. Jerome moved with it not as a person but as matter, his location changing while his name stayed fixed. At home, the absence hardened into something durable. A chair left empty became simply the way the room was arranged. Conversations adjusted. The promise of return was not revoked, but it was no longer spoken aloud. To speak, it felt like tempting disappointment. Every few years, there was another review. Another meeting where his file was opened, pages turned, then closed again. Someone would say, "We've exhausted the options." Someone else would nod. Jerome's fate was filed under constraints, beyond control. The difference between missing and dead revealed itself slowly. Missing required attention. Dead allowed mourning. Jerome occupied neither space. His family learned how to live inside that narrow corridor where memory could not settle. No one asked what Jerome would have wanted. There was no forum for that question. His last known actions were sufficient to define him: officially pilot transport mission loss at altitude. The rest was personal and therefore unrecorded. Years turned into decades. The glacier continued its patient work, grinding metal and bone together, redistributing the story piece by piece. Jerome's presence became diffuse, carried far from the impact point, though no one knew that yet. A new generation learned his name as something spoken carefully, not past tense, not present, just stated. Jerome Goebel. The sound of it remained unchanged even as context eroded. Once during a briefing many years later, an officer gestured toward the old report and said, "This case is closed." The words did not reach Jerome. They reached only those who still felt the weight of an unfinished sentence. No marker was placed, no coordinates fixed. Jerome's last location was defined by uncertainty that had become institutional. The search had ended, but the waiting had not. If Jerome could have seen the glacier from above, he would not have recognized it as his resting place. He had trusted instruments, charts, procedures. None of them accounted for this long erasure. The world adjusted around his absence. Laws accommodated it. Forms allowed for it. Life made room. But the space Jerome occupied was not filled. It was simply avoided, stepped around with care. Somewhere inside the ice, his dog tag rested against fragments of aircraft skin, its edges dulled by time and pressure. It still carried his name, though no one was there to read it. The official record remained unchanged for years at a time. Jerome Goebel stayed exactly where he had been placed, unresolved. The glacier moved, the family aged. The gap between the two widened. No announcement marked the moment when searching truly stopped. It happened gradually, through silence and omission. Jerome did not vanish again. He simply was no longer pursued. And yet, despite the closing of files and the settling of snow, the story did not end. It paused. It waited, much like the people who still measured time by a flight that never arrived, holding on to a name that refused to stay buried. Jerome Goebel did not feel the glacier move. He did not register the passing summers, the subtle thinning of ice, the way pressure released objects that had been held for decades. If time had a texture where he was, it was uniform pressing without markers. And yet his name was still traveling, carried inside metal and bone, inching toward daylight. In 2012, the surface of the Colony Glacier changed just enough to reveal something that did not belong to it. Wind scoured a patch clean. Meltwater traced shallow channels. What emerged first was not Jerome himself, but a fragment shaped by human hands, its edges torn and bent. Aircraft skin, the kind Jerome had once inspected with gloved fingers. A helicopter passed overhead, rotors beating the air into a dull roar. From above, a crew member leaned toward the window, eyes tracking a glint that caught the light differently than ice. "Hold on," he said, voice sharp with recognition. "That's not rock." The helicopter circled. Jerome's resting place, long carried away from the impact site, lay far from where anyone had last looked for him. The glacier had transported him without record, a slow conveyor reshaping geography while paperwork stayed fixed. They landed at a cautious distance. Boots crunched against a surface that groaned faintly beneath weight. The air smelled clean and thin, tinged with cold metal. One of them knelt, brushing away loose frost with a careful hand. More fragments appeared. Pieces of structure. Evidence of force. Jerome's final environment, announcing itself without ceremony. Then the dog tag surfaced. It was not his. The name stamped into the metal belonged to another man from the same flight. Still, the object mattered because it had traveled with Jerome, shared his confinement, shared the glacier's long patience. The tag was scratched, its chain broken. Someone lifted it gently, holding it up so the light caught the letters. "We need to report this," he said. Jerome remained where he was, but the conditions around him had changed. For the first time in decades, his location was no longer theoretical. Coordinates were logged, photographs taken. His story, dormant but intact, stirred. The discovery did not announce Jerome by name. It announced possibility, and that was enough to reopen doors that had been shut quietly years before. A researcher would later stand over those same images, studying the way debris clustered the slope of the ice, the direction of flow. Jerome's fate began to resolve not as an event, but as a pattern. The glacier had done what glaciers do. It had carried him away from the moment of impact and presented him elsewhere, altered but not erased. Back at home, Jerome's name still lived in a suspended tense. But something shifted. A call was made, a file reopened, a notation added. The language changed from finality to review. On the glacier, the work was methodical. Each item recovered was bagged, labeled, mapped. The cold crept into fingers even through insulation. Breath fogged the air. The men and women there spoke in short sentences, conserving energy, aware of risk. None of them spoke to Jerome directly, but every movement was made because of him. "This was part of the fuselage," someone said, tapping a bent panel. "Matches the model." Jerome had trusted that fuselage once. He had known its sounds, its vibrations. Now it lay fractured, its purpose ended, but still capable of telling his story. The glacier shifted again with the season. Meltwater ran faster. New objects appeared, then vanished under fresh snowfall. Each summer brought a narrow window. Each year, the field team returned, drawn back by what Jerome's presence made possible. The researcher, his name still unspoken, sat late at night with maps spread across a table, tracing lines with a pencil worn down by erasure. He followed the glacier's path backward, calculating where Jerome must have been years earlier. It was not guesswork. It was patience applied to data. If the ice moved him this far, he said to no one, then there will be more. Jerome's remains were not whole. They would never be. The glacier had broken continuity into pieces. But the pieces existed. That mattered. At home, the waiting took on a new shape. It was no longer static. It moved forward cautiously, afraid to hope too quickly. Jerome's name was spoken again in conversations that ended with uncertainty, but also with attention. On the glacier, the soundscape was sparse. Wind, distant cracking. The occasional radio call. When a fragment emerged, a shard of bone, a scrap of fabric, the team paused. Gloves came off. Notes were made. Jerome's physical trace, reduced but persistent, resisted erasure. A hand brushed ice away from a small object half buried. This could be personal, someone said. Personal meant human. It meant Jerome. The object was catalogued, not interpreted. Interpretation would come later in labs, far from the glacier. Here the task was recovery, not conclusion. Jerome's story, once confined to a line, in a report now occupied space again. It required planning, resources, attention. It asked for precision. Each of those demands acknowledged that he was still present in some form that could be addressed. The researcher assembled reports that linked what was found to who was missing. He did not imagine Jerome's last moments. He did not speculate. He let the glacier speak through displacement and emergence. He trusted process the way Jerome had trusted checklists. "This isn't finished," he said during one briefing. "Not yet." The words traveled. They reached agencies, families' archives. They did not reach Jerome, but they were spoken because of him. As seasons passed, more material surfaced. Some of it belonged to others on the flight. Some of it could not yet be named. But all of it narrowed the field. Jerome's presence became more specific, more localized. His long journey through ice began to reverse, piece by piece. The glacier continued its work indifferent to human intention. But now, humans worked with it, timing their efforts to its rhythms, reading its changes. Jerome's fate depended on that coordination. On a later visit, a team member paused, looking out over the expanse of ice. "Hard to believe," he said quietly, "that it's all been moving this whole time." Jerome had moved with it. Not by choice, not by action, but his story had not stayed still. Back at home, the idea of Jerome as a fixed point began to loosen. He was no longer only the man who vanished. He was becoming the man being found. The glacier did not release everything at once. It never would. But it had released enough to change the direction of the story. Jerome's name, carried forward by process and persistence, was no longer anchored solely to loss. It was tied now to discovery, careful and incomplete but real. What emerged from the ice did not answer every question. It did not restore what was lost. But it altered the trajectory that had held Jerome in place for decades. His presence, once buried and static, was now active again, shaping decisions, drawing people back to a place they had long since stopped watching. The glacier shifted. Summer ended. Snow returned. Jerome remained, but he was no longer alone in the dark. Jerome Goebel entered the process. Again, not as a pilot, not as a name on a roster, but as fragments laid out under bright laboratory lights. The transition was stark. Ice gave way to stainless steel. Wind was replaced by the low hum of ventilation. What had once been held by a glacier was now held by gloved hands, trained to read what pressure and time had done. A technician lifted a sealed container and read the label aloud. "Goebel Jerome, Field Recovery." Saying it anchored the work. It reminded everyone that this was not debris management. This was a person, returning in pieces. The fragments were small, bone-worn, thin edges rounded. Jerome's body had been reshaped by years of compression and movement. Each piece was photographed, measured, weighed. Nothing was assumed. Every step required confirmation. "This one's cortical," a forensic specialist said, turning a fragment under the light. "Human." Jerome's presence sharpened. Human meant the process advanced. It meant the careful progression from possibility to attribution. The lab smelled faintly of disinfectant and cold air. Jerome's fragments rested on absorbent pads arranged to avoid contact. The dog tag that had traveled near him was stored separately, its chain cataloged, its scratches documented. It was an object that had known him even if it did not bear his name. A dental record from the 1950s lay open nearby, its paper brittle, its diagrams precise. Jerome had sat in a chair once, while those notes were made jaw open, trusting routine. Now the same details were being sought again decades later to speak on his behalf. A researcher leaned closer to a monitor, displaying magnified images. "We need a clean extraction," she said. "If there's anything left to read." The bone was powdered carefully, the process slow and deliberate. Jerome's material history was reduced further, to retrieve what time had not entirely erased. Centrifuges spun. Samples were treated, filtered, preserved. Each action carried the risk of loss. Each pause carried weight. "If this fails," someone said quietly, "we go to dental." Jerome's identity moved along parallel paths. One relied on genetic trace, the other on remembered structure. Both were tethered to who he had been before the flight. A relative had agreed to provide a sample. The consent form bore a signature that trembled slightly, ink pressing hard into paper. Jerome's name appeared again, written by someone who had waited for it to be called back. The sample was packaged, labeled, and logged. The chain of custody mattered. Precision mattered. In another room, data analysts worked through correlations. The risk system translated records into probabilities, aligning dates, locations, physical traits. Jerome became a convergence of variables. Height, age, assignment. Each narrowed the field. "This matches his profile," an analyst said, pointing to a line of code on the screen. High confidence. Jerome's story advanced through calculation and restraint. No single result was allowed to carry the conclusion alone. Confirmation required overlap. The mtDNA result arrived first. A technician read the numbers twice before speaking. Consistent, she said. The word landed carefully. It did not claim finality. It invited continuation. Dental comparison followed. The lab compared old charts to new images, tracing angles and spacing. A molar fragment aligned. Another matched wear patterns noted decades earlier. Jerome's mouth, once part of casual conversation and routine meals, now spoke with quiet authority. There's alignment here, the odontologist said. Multiple points. The room held stillness, the kind created by attention rather than quiet. Jerome's identity took shape, not through a single revelation, but through accumulation. Each piece agreed with the others. Each reduced doubt. A meeting was convened. Reports were stacked neatly. Screens displayed findings. Jerome's name appeared at the top of each document, followed by language that edged closer to certainty. Based on available evidence, an official began, then paused. He adjusted his glasses. We can attribute these remains to Captain Jerome Goebel. No one reacted immediately. The statement required absorption. It carried responsibility. Another voice spoke, measured. Are we satisfied with the threshold? Yes, came the reply. Multiple independent confirmations. Jerome had crossed a boundary. He moved from being a candidate to being identified. The process that had once reduced him to fragments now restored coherence, not physically but formally. Paperwork followed. Signatures. Dates. Jerome's status changed in records that had held him in suspension for decades. The word identified replaced what had come before. It was administrative language, but it altered everything. A call was placed. The tone was practiced respectful. We have an update, the representative said. Jerome's name was spoken again, this time attached to certainty. The family member on the other end of the line listened without interrupting. When the explanation ended, there was a pause. So it's him, they said. Not a question. Yes, came the answer. Jerome did not hear this, but the effect of it traced back to him. His long movement through ice and analysis had arrived at recognition. In the lab, his fragments were prepared for transfer. Each was wrapped, labeled, handled with care that bordered on reverence. The technicians moved slower, now aware that the work had shifted from investigation to return. One of them adjusted a tag and said softly, "Welcome home, Captain." It was not protocol, it was human. Jerome's dog tag was placed alongside the remains reunited after a long separation. Metal and bone shared space again, no longer buried, no longer traveling without purpose. Reports were finalized. The risk analysis was archived. Dental charts were returned to storage. Each system that had touched Jerome released him in turn, its role complete. The lab emptied. Lights dimmed. Jerome's presence lingered only in documentation and care instructions. The work had been exacting, restrained, and relentless. It had not imagined him. It had listened to what remained. What science could do had been done. What it could not restore was acknowledged without ceremony. Jerome's body would never be whole again. That was not the measure of success. The measure was this: his name now rested where it belonged, attached to him, no longer floating between possibilities. The fragments that had carried him through decades of pressure had been enough. As the case file closed, an official placed it in a box marked with the year. 73, he said almost to himself. Jerome Goebel had been reconstructed not as he once was, but as he could be known now. Through care, through restraint, through an insistence that fragments still mattered, he was gathered back into the world that had waited for him to be named again. The call did not arrive with ceremony. It came on an ordinary day, at an ordinary hour, when life had already arranged itself around the idea that Jerome Goebel might never be definitively named again. The phone rang, and someone answered it without urgency. That detail mattered. It showed how long waiting had trained expectation downward. "This is the Department of Defense," the voice said. Formal, careful. "We're calling regarding Captain Jerome Goebel." The name still carried weight, even after decades. It slowed the listener's breathing. Papers were set aside. A chair was pulled closer to the table the way people do when they sense something irreversible approaching. "We have completed the identification process," the voice continued. There was a pause, measured, respectful. "We can now confirm that the remains recovered from the Colony Glacier belonged to him." No one spoke immediately. The confirmation did not rush in like relief. It arrived cautiously, testing whether it was allowed to stay. For years, Jerome had existed in a conditional state suspended between categories. To hear his name spoken without qualification felt unfamiliar. "So, it's him," the family member said, at last. The words were steady, but the hand holding the phone tightened until the knuckles ached. "Yes," the representative replied. "It's him." The sentence closed a loop that had been open since 1952. Not emotionally, not yet, but administratively undeniably. Jerome Goebel was no longer listed as missing. He was now identified, located, accounted for. The file that had hovered unresolved through generations was finally altered. After the call ended, no one moved for several minutes. There was nothing to do yet. No immediate action could match the scale of what had shifted. The room held the same furniture, the same light, but something fundamental had changed. Jerome was no longer suspended. He had arrived, even if only in fragments. Later that day, the family gathered. Some came with notebooks, some with nothing but memory. Jerome's name was spoken repeatedly, not to summon him, but to test the sound of it in this new context. Each repetition steadied it further. "They found him," one person said, as if the words required practice. Another replied, "After all this time." No one finished that thought. Time was the wrong unit now. What mattered was that the waiting had altered shape. It had turned into something else, something heavier but also more grounded. Documents arrived next. Official letters printed on thick paper. Dates were spelled out in full. December 2nd, 2025. The language was precise, restrained, and final. Jerome's status had changed. The phrasing did not soften the transition. It did not need to. The truth carried its own gravity. A representative offered to explain the process again. "DNA, dental records, statistical correlation," he said. The family listened politely, but the details no longer mattered in the same way. What mattered was that the systems had agreed, that Jerome's name had returned attached to him. There were safeguards, the representative added, anticipating concern. Multiple confirmations. "That's good," someone said. And it was. Accuracy mattered. Jerome deserved that. The shift from waiting to remembrance did not happen all at once. It came in increments. First, there was acknowledgement, then permission. Permission to grieve without reservation. Permission to plan something concrete. A service. A marker. A place where Jerome could be addressed directly, not hypothetically. Someone retrieved an old photograph. Jerome stood in uniform posture, relaxed but alert. The edges of the photo had softened over time. A finger traced the outline of his face. "He looks young," someone observed. "He was," another replied. That fact had been easy to overlook while Jerome was unresolved. Now, it pressed forward. He had lived only a portion of the life he might have had. That was not new information, but it landed differently when paired with certainty. A question surfaced quietly, then grew louder. What would he have wanted? No one answered immediately. Jerome had not left instructions for this situation. He had expected to return before winter. He had planned for continuity, not closure. They spoke instead about what he valued: routine, responsibility, following procedure, not out of fear, but out of respect for order. He had trusted systems. He had believed that careful work mattered. In that sense, the way he had been found felt aligned with who he was. "I think he'd be glad it was done right," someone said. There was agreement. Jerome's identification had not been rushed. It had been earned through patience and precision. That felt appropriate. Arrangements followed. Conversations with officials. Decisions about timing. Where Jerome would be laid to rest. Each choice required articulation. Each made the reality more tangible. When the remains were transferred, the family was offered the option to be present. Some chose to come. Others could not. There was no pressure. Jerome's return allowed for variation, not obligation. The container was smaller than many expected. No one commented on that aloud. It was understood. Jerome's body had endured forces that did not preserve wholeness. What returned was enough. A flag was folded with care. A uniformed hand held it out crisp and practiced. "On behalf of a grateful nation," the officer said. The phrase had been used countless times, but here it did not feel generic. It applied specifically to Jerome, finally, conclusively. The family member who received it nodded. "Thank you," they said. The words were adequate. Nothing more was required. In the days that followed, stories surfaced. Not heroic narratives, not embellishments. Small details. The way Jerome double-checked his checklist even when others didn't. The way he promised to write. The way he hummed without realizing it. These fragments had lived in memory for decades, waiting for a context that could hold them without strain. Now they had one. The official record closed quietly. Jerome's file was marked complete. That word complete carried weight. It did not suggest fullness. It suggested resolution. The systems that had tracked him released him from process. But for the family, completeness was something else. It was the ability to speak Jerome's name without adding qualifiers. To say he died instead of he disappeared. To acknowledge loss without defending it against doubt. One person remarked, "I didn't realize how much we were still holding back." Another nodded, "Because we didn't know if we were allowed to." The difference mattered. Knowing did not erase pain. It redirected it. It gave it a place to go. At the service, Jerome's name was read aloud again. This time it was followed by dates that bracketed his life clearly. There was no asterisk, no open-ended notation. The sound of his name settled into the space and stayed. Someone spoke a brief line they remembered him saying, "I'll be back before winter." The sentence carried a different resonance now. It was no longer a promise waiting to be fulfilled. It was a fragment of his voice preserved and honored. Afterward, people lingered. Not because they didn't know how to leave, but because they wanted to remain in the presence of something finished. Finished did not mean easy. It meant stable. Later, when the room emptied, a family member stayed behind and placed a hand on the marker. The surface was cool, solid. Jerome had a location now. A place where touch met certainty. "I'm glad you're not lost anymore," they said quietly. That was the truth of it. Jerome had not returned whole. He had not returned alive. But he had returned enough to end the waiting. Enough to shift the family's relationship with time. What had been suspended for generations could finally move forward. Not past Jerome, but with him now firmly located in history, rather than hovering outside it. The identification did not give back the years. It did not restore conversations that never happened. But it replaced conjecture with fact, and that replacement mattered deeply. It allowed memory to settle into a shape that could be carried without constant tension. Jerome Goebel was no longer a question mark. He was a person whose story, while incomplete, was now anchored. The long delay had altered the way his return was received, but it had not diminished its significance. Knowing the truth, this late did not change what was lost. It changed how loss was held. And for a family that had lived for decades in a suspended state, that change was everything. After the service, after the papers were signed and the chairs stacked, Jerome Goebel remained present in a different way. Not as a problem to be solved, not as a file to be moved along, but as a settled fact that people had to learn how to live beside. The family did not speak of closure. That word felt too clean. What they felt instead was weight redistributed. A relative returned home and opened a drawer that had not been opened in years. Inside were small things that had never found a proper category. A folded note written in Jerome's hand, a spare button from a uniform, a pocket calendar with dates crossed out in pencil. The calendar stopped in November. No explanation followed it. The pages beyond were blank. Someone held the note carefully, afraid it might tear. It was not a letter he had mailed. It was a draft written on base stationery, never folded for an envelope. The handwriting leaned slightly to the right, disciplined but personal. "Landing tonight. I'll write properly when I'm warm." That was the new detail. Not a revelation, not a secret, just a sentence that had waited quietly to be read in the right moment. Jerome had planned to write twice. Once immediately, once properly. The distinction mattered to him. "I didn't know this existed," the family member said aloud, though no one else was in the room. Jerome's waiting had extended further than anyone realized. Even his unfinished intentions had been preserved. The people who had loved him adjusted to this knowledge slowly. They did not rush to reframe their memories. They let them sit alongside this late-arriving fragment, allowing it to complicate rather than resolve. Jerome had been careful. Jerome had been thinking ahead. Jerome had assumed continuity. One person began visiting the marker regularly. Not every day. Not out of obligation. Just often enough to keep the habit alive. They brought nothing with them, no flowers, no tokens. They stood hands in pockets and spoke when they felt like it. "You'd probably say this is excessive," they said once, almost smiling. "Standing around like this." Jerome did not answer. He did not need to. The words were not requests. They were updates. The family learned that remembering Jerome now required different work. Before, memory had been guarded, protected from conclusion. Now it could move freely. Stories were told without hesitation. His habits were described without fear of tempting fate. He had checked locks twice. He had lined up his shoes. He had kept a pencil sharpened beyond necessity. A niece asked, "Why the pencil?" He said, "You never know when you'll need to write something down," came the reply. The pencil appeared later, in another drawer, shorter than expected, worn down to a stub. It had traveled moves through decades, without being discarded. No one could remember who had kept it, only that it had always been there. That pencil was placed beside the calendar and the note. A small constellation of objects that did not explain Jerome, but outlined him. Elsewhere, the researcher continued working. Not on Jerome's case, that part was done, but on others that resembled it in shape, if not in detail. He did not speak Jerome's name often now. He did not need to. The lesson of that recovery had settled into his method. Patience. Correlation. Trust in incremental truth. "We don't force it," he told a colleague. "We wait until the record can support itself." Jerome had taught that without intending to. For the family, the future no longer required guarding against reversal. There would be no new call contradicting the last. Jerome's status would not shift again. That stability allowed grief to behave differently. It could rise and fall without fear of being undone. At a small gathering months later, someone raised a glass and said, "To Jerome." The toast was simple. No qualifiers followed. No one corrected the tense. They talked about what he might have done if he had returned. The speculation was gentle, not corrective. It did not compete with reality. It acknowledged that there had been paths not taken, without trying to walk them retroactively. One person said, "He would have hated the cold here." Another replied, "He did hate it." Laughter surfaced briefly, then settled. The sound felt permitted now. The marker became part of the landscape of their lives. Directions were given, using it as a reference point. "Past Jerome's place," someone said once without thinking. The phrasing stuck. On one visit, a family member noticed frost forming along the edge of the stone. It traced the engraved letters, carefully outlining each one. Jerome Goebel. The name appeared brighter for a moment, then dulled as the sun shifted. "I can't pretend I know what it felt like for him to believe he'd be home before winter." The narrator reflects, standing at a distance that respects both time and loss. "But I can see what it means now to stand in front of a name that no longer drifts." That was the lasting change. Jerome's story no longer moved without anchor. It rested where it could be returned to, touched, spoken to directly. The long years of waiting had not been erased, but they had been transformed into context rather than condition. The family did not feel finished with Jerome. They felt accompanied. On a final visit before leaving town, someone knelt and brushed snow away from the base of the marker with a bare hand. The cold bit sharply. They did it anyway, clearing just enough to see the stone meet the ground. The pencil stub was set gently against the marker, its wood darkened with age, its point worn flat. It stayed there, a small object, completing a long journey. That was what remained, a name, a place, a habit of care, and a pencil resting against cold stone finally put down. Jerome Goebel does not recede now. He stays not loudly, not insistently, but with a steadiness that did not exist before his name was returned. The glacier continues its slow work far away, indifferent to what it once carried. That movement no longer defines him. Within the family, Jerome's name settles into use. It appears in sentences that do not pause for explanation. It is spoken to orient memory, not to reopen wounds. His story is no longer a gap people step around. It has edges now, and those edges hold. There is no sense of triumph in this, only recognition. The recognition that waiting shaped lives in ways that cannot be reversed, and that knowing arrived too late to repair them, but not too late to matter. Jerome is no longer suspended between categories. He occupies a place that can be returned to. The researcher closes his notebook at the end of another long day. He does not think of Jerome as an example. He thinks of him as proof that time does not erase, everything only hides it. At the marker, frost gathers again as evening comes. The engraved letters catch the last light. A hand rests briefly on the stone, feeling its temperature, its solidity. The pencil stub remains where it was left, unmoved by wind. Jerome Goebel is no longer traveling. His name has stopped moving.